because they don't tell generation and flexibility how to operate, there's like a growing problem with things like interconnectors and storage. So they respond to the national price, even though they're located in different areas. And this does create some like kind of slightly perverse behaviors where we're importing from Norway to flow that power down to sort of like London, even though we've got constraints there. So we can't actually do that. So then the control room has to then turn down more wind in Scotland. From the system side of things, is quite a big thing that zonal pricing can help to solve.
Hello everybody, welcome back for another instalment of Transmission. In today's episode, Modo Energy's Robyn Lucas and Wendel Hortop join guest host Ed Porter to discuss the key takeaways from the second consultation, the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, or REMA. If you're enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. And with that, let's jump in.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Modo's Transmission. Today we're going to be doing the second part of our REMA two-parter.
Woo.
There we go. And we first visited this on the 27th of October 2022. So time in energy market regulation does fly. Yeah, here we are, circa 18 months later. And yeah, today we're really excited. So Wendel, you're joining us as well as Robyn to essentially run through all of the latest from REMA. Now, because of what REMA is, a review of electricity market arrangements, there are some kind of complicated things that will go into this, and we won't have time today to run through all of it from scratch. But there are lots of good resources that will steer you in the right direction, and we'll put that into the show notes. But just to get started, Wendel, maybe you could kick us off in terms of just very high level, what is REMA?
Yeah, so REMA is the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, and I think at its most basic level, it's kind of designing the markets that will take us from where we are today to essentially a net zero electricity system, or the markets that can do that in the best sort of way. What exists today was set up like 1990s, late 1990s, and so clearly doesn't quite fit the sort of world where renewables is going to be the biggest source of generation system. So yeah, that's basically the crux of it.
Set up 1990s, also updated at several parts. Last updated EMR 2012, 2013, 2014, and now it's feeling a little bit like that EMR is slightly out of date for the future system we want. Enter REMA. And maybe Robyn, coming to you. So in terms of the process for REMA, we've had the first consultation. What has changed since that first consultation? How is this kind of second stage of the consultation different to that?
So that first consultation, the big talking point off the back of it was locational marginal pricing or nodal pricing. And there was a lot of talk about that in the industry amongst a bunch of other stuff. So I think the main thing that's gone away as a result of that first consultation in the new one is we are moving away from locational marginal pricing. So nodal is not going to be the future of the UK market. Instead, zonal is on the table, as well as still retaining the national electricity price. So odds on probably zonal, I think is probably what we feel like. But yeah, it's by no means a certainty. Other things in the consultation are talking about shortening of settlement periods. So currently the GB has 30-minute settlement periods. Other markets, so for example Australia, some of the US markets, they have 50-minute or 5-minute markets. So that is kind of better suited. The shorter the settlement period, the better suited it is to intermittent generation. So that's one of the things that's in the consultation. Otherwise, we have capacity market reform, so splitting the capacity market in various ways to better fit the future. Some stuff around CFDs, long duration energy storage, and some of the other maybe hydrogen to power schemes, which are for evolving technologies which wouldn't necessarily fit within the capacity market.
Mm-hmm. So lots of content in there. We will definitely go through that and kind of and pick it off today in as much as we have time for it. So actually, let's just go back to that kind of first part. So when we're talking about a zonal system, what does that mean? Have we got a fully defined set of zones that we're going to use from now until 2050, or is this up in the air?
No, there's been quite a few maps on LinkedIn.
Yeah, but they're all different.
Yes.
Yeah, everyone's got their different zones. So yeah, the answer is no. Like in the consultation, there's no sort of suggestion of what these zones could look like, which makes it quite hard then to actually work out what to respond to this with. But yeah, it's kind of, there's sort of anywhere between 2 to 14 zones.
So yeah, the most basic setup would be having a north zone and a south zone. You feel like you probably wouldn't capture all of the differences in locations with just 2 zones, although you would probably get the bulk majority of it, which is onshore wind in Scotland.
Yeah, and I guess just quickly, I mean, by zone, essentially just splitting the market up into different areas, different geographic areas.
Just on that, so when you say you split the market up into different areas, like what exactly do you mean? So you're saying you get a brand new wholesale price by zone depending on supply and demand in that particular area?
Yeah, so essentially a zone, you would have just this own little wholesale market. And now if you had enough transmission capacity between each zones, you end up with just the same price everywhere. But kind of, I guess the thing we'll come on to is all that stuff and constraints. And as soon as you've got a constraint, that creates different prices in these zones.
So in effect, if we treat that 2-zone system, in the north you have less demand and more wind, and in the south you have more demand and probably more solar. Those two would therefore lead to slightly different price shapes over the day, different prices. And when there's enough transmission capacity, so all the power can flow where it needs to without any issues, the price in the north and south would be the same. But as soon as you've got a constrained boundary somewhere, you'd get differences in price.
Yeah, and by a constrained boundary, we mean like a transmission wire that is not able to flow any more power across it.
Great example, B6 boundary between the north of England and Scotland, that has quite a severe constraint, which means that you can't get all of the power that's produced in Scotland down to the demand centres in the south.
Okay. And why are we seeing some maps that have 2 zones and why are we seeing some maps that have got 14 zones? Like why are you picking why would you make a zone? Like what's the point of it?
I guess they kind of lay it out in the consultation, like the kind of pros and cons of having more zones. Like ultimately you can just get more and more zones, and then you end up at nodal pricing. And I guess the reason to have less is just to make it simpler to implement, simpler to operate in. But ultimately, you still need to be able to capture like the main constraints. And so, I think it's just a balance of kind of how deep they want to go with kind of capturing those constraints, like all those constraints, or whether they just look at the major, like top 4, top 5, and balancing that versus like...
Yeah, you also need to balance it with how much liquidity is in that zone as well. So if we were to take just London as a zone, there is only really demand. There's not a whole lot of generation in, within the M25. So that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from a liquidity point of view. Whereas if you were to do a larger area, which has a bit more generation in it, maybe that makes sense.
But that still should serve as a signal for people to build, right? So if, to take your example of London or say the southeast, if you have a lot of demand in that area, then, and not so much generation, when you get constraints, you might have a different price for that region, which might be higher, which should incentivize more plant to try and locate in that area. And that's kind of the big shift with locational pricing, isn't it? To try and encourage people to build in the right places.
Yeah, absolutely. It's supposed to incentivize those investment decisions so that you have the right generation with the right demand. However, if you think about somewhere like London, and I think this is probably one of the reasons that nodal has fallen by the wayside, it's not feasible. Like geographically, it's not feasible.
Yeah.
So zonal probably makes more sense.
And I think maybe the kind of the comparison to this is the current system, right? So the current system, we have a national price, but there are locational elements in it, and whatever system we choose, like it's going to be similar equipment being used. So how do we do locational? Maybe Wendel, how do we do locational pricing today? And maybe that might give us a bit of a lesson for what the future might look like.
So this is a good thing that they split this out in the consultation. So it's like today we do have locational investment signals. There is like transmission charging, there's distribution charging. There are kind of all these sort of local constraint markets you can kind of get involved with. But especially the big ones, so transmission and distribution charging, they're like a fixed sort of charge each year. Like some of them have even been argued they kind of don't drive good behaviours. And so even though it might say, okay, don't put wind in Scotland, it doesn't tell that how to actually operate. It doesn't really give it like a signal to drive that. And so so that's kind of what we've seen to date, is it doesn't actually change fundamentally what people are doing.
And in terms of like operational today, so how do we manage, like, so let's say we get a constraint, how do we manage that locationally?
Yeah, so then that just all goes into the balancing mechanism. So that's kind of like, I guess, the fundamental of why this change has been brought up, because as we get more and more renewables, as we get more and more constraints, the amount that the control room is having to do to balance the system is just growing and growing and growing, to the point that like it starts to become not really feasible if we look in like 10 years time.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the points to touch on there in the consultation is they're having a central dispatch is still on the table. So if we have a situation where we have more zones, so I don't know, maybe 7, 10, 14 zones, 14 being the number of distribution network regions, which is probably where that number comes from, that National Grid could dispatch everyone from its central location rather than everyone being self-dispatching, which is what we have now. The argument being there is so much volume redispatched within the BM, it actually looks more like a central dispatch system at the moment in reality.
So just to kind of cover those, self-dispatch, individual market operators get to decide what to do with their own plant. They get to respond to wholesale prices and schedule their plant however they see fit. Central dispatch is where someone centrally, it could be like a control room, decides that certain plants should run at certain times. And so those are the two options. Traditionally, centralized dispatch really with like nodal plant, whereas self-dispatch is more for sort of national or zonal pricing. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Another big element of it is that even though we do have some of these signals, because they don't tell sort of generation and flexibility how to operate, there's like a growing problem with things like interconnectors and storage. So they respond to the national price, even though they're located in different areas. And this does create some like kind of slightly perverse behaviors where we're like importing from Norway to flow that power down to sort of like London, even though we've got constraints there. So we can't actually do that. So then the control room has to then turn down more wind in Scotland. So I think that's kind of from the system side of things is quite a big sort of thing that zonal pricing can help to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they kind of explicitly call out zonal pricing means storage and interconnection will be working in a more efficient way in a zonal system versus the national system. And I suppose maybe the flip side of that. So if I'm a wind developer or a wind owner, right, I'm not going to be happy about this, because I don't want to be. There are some very good places to build wind in the UK, and so for example off the coast of Scotland, north of Scotland, I want to build there. That's where I can get permits for my wind, and that's where I've got plans to build, and that takes quite a lot of time to put that together. Okay, great. Someone's now telling me that REMA is going to save the whole system money. But for me, how do I get comfortable? How do I enter into like contracts to start building my wind if you're going to say, actually, you might be subject to a price that is just for Scotland? And that might happen quite a lot. So I might see significantly lower prices in a Scottish zone in comparison to kind of the whole of GB. Like, how do I get comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly valid question, right? The capture rate that you're suddenly seeing for your Scottish zone is going to be way worse than it would be for your national price, where your capture rate is the average power price you get for your renewable power compared to the average wholesale price, like all the time. So I think that's where the CFD reforms really come in. So we still want to be able to incentivize offshore wind. We have, as you say, really brilliant locations for wind in this country. So it will be through another market mechanism, which is where there are reforms to the CFD in REMA as well, which will ensure that we still build enough wind to meet our net zero goals.
I suppose one of the challenges there would be, so with the CFD contracts for difference, essentially you get topped up to a strike price, no matter what the price is. When I said no matter, actually, if you get negative pricing, then you don't get paid that CFD. Now, what might be the complications of going to a zonal pricing with that type of CFD structure?
So I think, as you get more locational, those kind of that price shape volatility kind of gets like extrapolated. And so if you're in Scotland, you'd expect to see more negative pricing. And so it's kind of, so then that it's kind of like pushing that even further. So you end up kind of with wind wanting to turn off even more through the CFD. There's kind of lots of different outcomes that you can see happening. It's like
and that's where some of the changes have been or the changes to the CFD might be quite useful. So CFD at the moment,
it's what, 6 hours or 8 hours?
The old one was 6 hours. The new one is as soon as you get to negative pricing in day ahead, essentially you don't get paid your CFD strike price. the things that they're considering are things like deemed CFDs, which is essentially you consider what that wind site should have been producing, and they get paid that over the course of the year. But crucially, they have the ability to turn off in negative pricing, and so they don't kind of carry on generating.
So at the moment, there is really no incentive for wind to turn off, whereas in the new deemed CFD, it was more like an annual figure that you're receiving rather than actually like live generation.
Yeah.
So you should be turning off when the system needs you to.
Yeah, and we should say here that within the CFD, so actually there have been some areas where they've given sort of certainty, they've given a preferred option of where they want to go to. So for example, with the optimized capacity market, which we'll come on to in a second, but within the CFDs, they haven't said this is what we're going to do. They've narrowed down the number of options, but there's still options on the table, similar to the national price and zonal price, still options on the table, but they haven't given us a kind of a final view yet.
Yeah, but I think that's because I guess they're linked. Like, I think that's like the final section of the consultation goes into this detail. Like, even though they break things out into these like kind of nice little component parts, they all relate to each other. They all link to each other, and so some choices will mean it's like more likely that you go with. So, for example, I think if they say if they go with zonal, you could look at like a capacity-based CFD as more of like a kind of potential solution than a deemed CFD. It gets into a lot of detail like that.
Ultimately, with a capacity market, with a CFD, and then with the wholesale price, which could be zonal or national, you've got three different places, and then maybe balancing services and other markets too, where your generators are going to get cash flow to warrant the upfront investment, and we need to be very careful that they complement each other, and we're kind of doing it in a technology neutral way.
Okay.
So we don't have, I don't know, if wind's getting all of its cash in the CFD, which is setting a zero wholesale price the whole time, how is gas going to respond to that? How is gas going to pay for itself? That's all through the CM. So who's going to be participating in the wholesale markets? If it's storage, like, are we going to actually have any price shape within wholesale markets for storage to respond to and interconnectors to respond to? And it makes it a very much a non-level playing field for all of those different technologies to compete. So I think when we're bringing all these things together at the end of the consultation, being mindful of actually how these different technology types will be making money when we split up the wholesale market so much, split up the revenue stack so much.
And I think that's probably something that actually gets flagged a fair bit in the consultation, which is like this perverse outcome type thing, where effectively if government get too involved in the process, they ask for too much of a certain thing through a CFD, or they ask for too much of a certain thing within the capacity market, they can essentially block the wholesale market from doing what it should be doing, which is finding the lowest cost generator by zone if we end up going that way, or just by the entire country. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that consultation which flags up that risk. So they are aware of it, but it's 100% the right thing to be calling out. Last thing on zones. So, and this one surprised me a little bit. So it's not like the zones get fixed. So the zones aren't kind of fixed from now until 2050. They have some ideas around how often they might be reviewing it. So if you thought that when we decided on a final version of REMA and implemented it, we still won't be done in terms of like what changes might come down the road. I
mean, that makes a huge amount of sense, right? Because you get more generation built out over time, and the transmission infrastructure is going to get reinforced over time as well. So for example, what we're now 2024, by 2030 we expect the EC5 boundary, which is in East Anglia, all that's fairly constrained at the moment. We're going to have Hornsey coming in, Hornsey 3, which is going to constrain it even further. But that boundary is going to get reinforced, and it's essentially going to go away as a major constraint. So right now, it might make sense to have east of the EC5 its own zone, whereas by 2030, that doesn't make sense at all. So it really, it sounds quite sensible to me to have changing zones over time in response to how the transmission network and the generation stack evolves. However, on the flip side of that, it does present some investment risk and some, uncertainty around policy and regulation, which mean that essentially the cost of capital is going to go up.
Yeah. I saw one of the stats from there said cost of capital, potential impact 0 to 3%. 3% on the cost of capital is massive for and it kind of quotes for decades. And that's a huge, I think they quite rightly kind of say, well, actually, how much of this is really going to come through? Like if we set out what we want to do and we're very clear about the regulation we want to follow, like, will you then see a 3% increase in cost of capital? I think there's a fair challenge from government on that, but clearly they're being lobbied quite hard on it.
I think that's a good way to like look at it, is that if you move to a zonal system and some areas of the country then have cheaper pricing, so like a big thing that comes out of it is saving consumers money, which you can see how that could happen. Because, you know, if all of a sudden, if I'm in Scotland, my price of electricity isn't being set by gas, it's being set by wind most of the time. But if you're doing that, you're just shifting where that bit of money was before. It needs to go somewhere, like it needs to come from somewhere. And so you might just end up where, like, okay, instead of that coming from the wholesale market, that comes from the capacity market, it comes from the CFD.
That all has to be paid for in some bit of tax or other.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on from zonal, let's go to changes in settlement period. So Robyn, what's the plan here?
Okay, so we touched on this earlier. Currently, we have 30-minute settlement periods. One of the options is to change this to 15 minutes or to 5 minutes. Reason being, you can better submit what you are going to do in smaller chunks. So if you're ramping up a gas plant, you might ramp, I don't know, within an hour. If you've got 2 blocks of, which would be, you know, in the first settlement period in my ramp, I'm going to be, I don't know, 100 megawatts. And in the second settlement period, I'll be at 200 megawatts. If you've got shorter settlement periods, you would much better fit your actual physical ramp with what you are telling the control room you would do. And therefore, if they know better what's going to happen, they can react accordingly with balancing the system ultimately.
I guess importantly as well, you get pricing, like wholesale prices, which sort of are shaped around that ramp.
Yeah, which means you would probably get a bigger spike in the morning and a bigger spike in the evening.
Because your control room will already see like the shape of those ramps in terms of what gets submitted by the big transmission connected.
For the various dynamic parameters.
Exactly. I suppose is kind of what Wendell's saying, is that actually it's bringing a little bit of it out of the balancing mechanism and into the wholesale market. So you might better see in the wholesale market where you've got supply and demand balancing, not balancing.
We've been looking at the Texas market where they have 5-minute settlement in the real-time market, and you can really see the impact of ramping, and it causes quite significant spikes in the morning and the evenings as you deal with, you know, things can't change their outputs that quickly, and the implication that has on price. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the big benefits of short settlement periods from like kind of operations is like if I'm a solar farm, I can submit, you know, I don't generate electricity in half an hour chunks. I generate electricity kind of continuously, and maybe 5-minutely I can try to capture that shape. And so if I'm selling power, then all of a sudden I can do that in a much better way, or I can then kind of trade that power a lot better if I know like there's going to be a cloud coming over in 5 minutes time or something. But that then goes to the gate closure point. So how far ahead of time do I tell the control room that?
Because it's all about, you know, how good your renewable forecast is. And your renewable forecast is, just because it's in 5-minute blocks instead of half-an-hour blocks, is not actually going to be any better, because you're still having to produce that sort of an hour and a half out.
Okay.
So I think the impact in terms of like increased granularity for renewables, although great, I can, as Wendell says, submit a much more precise solar profile. Actually, I'm still having to make that forecast an hour and a half ahead of time. So the position is going to change within that gate closure. So it would make more sense to also shorten gate closure to me, because you're much, you know, the closer you are to real time, the better your forecasts are. Yeah. And essentially you're trying to forecast NIV, which is really difficult to do.
So lots of stuff in there. Maybe let's do a little bit of a recap, right? So currently we're saying half-hour settlement periods. If the first half of that we were particularly short of power, and in the second half of that we had excess power, so we were long on power, that really wouldn't show up in the wholesale prices too much, and we would leave it up to the control room to kind of deal with that and balance that out. If we make settlement periods shorter, e.g. 15 minutes, you can bring that into wholesale pricing and get people to respond to those price signals, which means that hopefully the market would be more balanced by the time it gets to the control room. So that's the settlement period.
Yeah, it should take some volume out of the BM.
Should take some volume out of the BM. And then we kind of seamlessly moved into the second part of this, which is gate closure. And I think we should kind of just cover this a little bit, which is essentially the point at which the wholesale market, so all of the trading that's done by people who are buying or selling power, they hand it all over to the control room, and then after gate closure, the control room is then responsible for making sure that essentially the lights don't go out, and they have an hour ahead of delivery to deal with this. And now in the consultation, they've said they were looking at shortening that period, which is called gate closure, to less than an hour. But that's where I like this conversation comes from, which is like, okay, what's the value of shortening that period? Could you get better forecasts for it? And so that's where we end up in this period. And we're saying actually better short assessment periods is a good thing, but if gate closure is still an hour out, you're still having to make guesses a long time in advance, and maybe that diminishes the value of short assessment period.
Yeah, it massively diminishes the impact of improved forecasts when you still have to produce them at the same time ahead of delivery.
Yeah, it's like the precision versus accuracy.
Yeah.
Like you can be more precise, but it's still...
You're not going to be any more accurate.
More accurate. And I think, so yeah, because you mentioned the ERCOT market, I think if we look at Australia, so in Australia you've got 5 minute settlement periods, but then gate closures is like 5 minute ahead of time. And so it means every 5 minutes you can kind of be responding to what is going to be happening in that 5 minutes. Like you have a lot better idea, but then that goes back to that's all centrally dispatched. And so that might be the thing here is like, if we want to keep self-dispatch, then there's like a limit to how probably.
So I think we've taken out the shortening that 60-minute gate closure because it's not feasible to do it within the timeframes of REMA. That's what it says in the consultation, which comes down to, again, technology within the control room being able to dispatch all of the system and then make sure the system is balanced within that. They don't think they can shorten that from 60 minutes quickly.
Yeah, so self-dispatch, everyone decides what they want their own plant to do. It kind of means you then have to have this period where some central dispatch steps in and makes sure everything works. But if you have a central dispatch slightly earlier, then you could bring gate closure much closer because it's already essentially already managed. Okay. All right. And then maybe a question for just like more on the storage side. So what would this mean for storage if we were to go from half hourly settlement to maybe 5 minute settlement periods?
I mean, ultimately, if you're, say, a battery, you can respond essentially like instantaneously. And so you can like fit a 5 minute, like if there's like a 5 minute price shape, then you can kind of very accurately respond to that. So it really does benefit those like flexible technologies that can kind of ramp within that 5 minute period. But that is limited by, that kind of price volatility and what actually the wholesale market's telling you. And so if that's limited by gate closure,
I think it will make prices more volatile, which is good for storage.
Okay.
And storage is perfectly placed to respond to those sort of settlement periods, where actually other flexible technology types like gas is less able to do so. Yeah. So it's really good for storage.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the capacity market. So here we have a preferred option, which is progress. The optimized CM is what's being looked at. What is the optimized CM?
They kind of throughout this term, so optimized CM like with minima.
With minima.
And it's almost like it's like everyone knows what that means, and it's like I don't think anyone does. But when you dig into the detail a bit, it basically means you have a capacity market where you've got kind of like still got like a single overriding capacity target you need to meet, but within that you kind of have these minimum targets for different types of capacity. And so the kind of examples would be, so for example, so low carbon capacity, or like kind of sustained response, so something that can kind of continually keep providing power or for a certain amount of time, or stuff that can respond maybe within 5 minutes, so more of like a reserve type capacity. And so what that could lead to is you've got these different pots of technologies competing within the wider kind of capacity market, but then you end up with different prices. And so all of a sudden, if I'm sort of a battery, maybe I get a different price in the capacity market to a CCGT gets.
I suppose that already happens today, right? Though, so we have derating for storage, and so we already see different prices in the capacity market, even though there is a single clearing price. So it's kind of carving it out so that there'll be almost like a separate auction that happens with a separate price.
So it feels like the better solution to what we have now, which is derating factors, because derating factors are entirely structured around loss of load, and this concept of having enough capacity on the system to make sure the lights stay on in scarcity events, which is probably, it's quite an old way of looking at having the security of supply on the system, and is, around really winter peaks where we're trying to cover 2, 3, 4, maybe up to 10 hours worth of loss of load through the loss of load calculation, which is valued at £6,000, which is, God knows where that comes from. Whereas with these minima, you're perhaps targeting different kinds of needs within the system. So long periods of like 100 plus hours where there's no wind, or very short periods, which is much more like intraday volatility, which is much more suited to storage. And as long as we carve out these minima to be completely technology agnostic, you just have a requirement of what you need. It might be low carbon, long duration reserve, as Wendel says. It makes kind of more sense than what we have now, which is not really fit for purpose, I don't think.
And to turn this into kind of the wording of the consultation, or like how government have put this together before. So we're talking about the reliability standards. So this kind of concept that you design an electricity market to meet a reliability standard. So you have no more than 3 hours of loss of load expected over the course of a year. That's then suggested by National Grid. Government then decides to do whatever they want to that in terms of bumping it up or bumping it down. But effectively, that's kind of how the CM comes through in terms of how much capacity it's procuring.
Which has a massive impact on the price, which ultimately the consumer has to pay.
Yeah. And so I think a little bit what you're saying here is, okay, we had that in 2013, 2014, and that was very much setting out, well, how do we start to introduce renewables but still have dispatchable power? We're now saying, okay, the types of problems we might have might be different in the future. So we might have winter weeks where we have low wind and high demand. It might be cold. And so we might need something to generate for, say, 200 or 300 hours consecutively. But at the same time, those technologies might not be the same technologies or the right technologies to provide intra-day, so stuff that happens within a day, balancing of renewables, things like storage. And so don't use one mechanism to procure both things at the same time, because it'll be quite complicated. Potentially use something like a minima to have two runs at it.
And it's not really, we don't really see the value that storage is getting through the very heavy derating factors we have now. So storage is massively benefiting the system for that intraday volatility, but we have like an 11% derating factor compared to, say, wind or gas, which are somehow seen as firmer because they don't have, obviously storage is duration limited, and that duration limited nature is very, very heavily penalised in the current calculations. Whereas if we have these different minima, perhaps storage would do better.
Yeah.
I think one interesting thing with this capacity market stuff is that you had like two big press releases that went out with the REMA consultation. So the first one was all talking about zonal pricing, which I think gives an indication of where the government wants that to go. But the second one was all around gas and the fact we're going to keep gas on the system. We're going to build new unabated gas. But then if you look in the consultation, like that's not mentioned anywhere. There's nothing which says this is how we're going to build more gas.
Glide into net zero.
There's a glide path. There is a glide path. Yeah.
But then I guess it all just comes into the capacity market, and I think essentially the way, hopefully, this would be set up is that if low carbon technologies can compete and can come to the market that provides, say, that sustained response, then maybe we don't need that gas. But because you've got this minimum, you've got this minimal target for having like 100-hour response requirement. If that low carbon technology can't provide that in the market, then we will go and buy more gas.
Yeah.
Can we talk about gas for a bit?
Please, yes.
Let's talk about gas. So one of the things that will always go on Slido in any National Grid event will be procuring gas, or Desna's event, will be procuring gas in a 15-year contract when we have 2030/2035 net zero targets. How's that compatible?
Yeah, it's not, is it? It's just not. I think we have to be a little bit honest. So on the gas front, so the recent T-4 auction had a £70 clearing price, and we had no new build gas come in. The new build gas that was in the pre-qualification rounds dropped out. So a £70 clearing price, which is a £3 billion cost to the consumer, was not enough to incentivise new build gas generation in 2024. How on earth are we going to bring in new build gas later? And having a 15-year contract for an unabated gas is just completely incompatible with 2035 net zero.
So in the capacity market, sort of a separate, there's all these different consultations going on, which makes it quite hard to keep track of. I guess, a separate capacity market reform bit of work, which was done last year, looks at bringing these emission limits. I guess it kind of looks at this point. So if you were new build gas or unabated technology, you would start to have emissions limits from 2034, and that I guess gets you up to that 2035
Well, it doesn't at all, Because that's 1 year.
Yeah, but then also within this latest consultation, there's a bit of like backsliding on that. So that's kind of been pushed back at least.
It's
2
just
years.
in like the background of a fairly weak COP in December as well. It just feels like 2035 is so far away from actually happening, which is it's quite sad.
Can I just say maybe actually a lot of this isn't to kind of one of the charts that came through in there was something about how often things are price setting, and in one of their charts they were trying to highlight that in 2030 for the marginal price, so the things that sets the price in GB, under 10% of the time that will be unabated gas. And so I think the thing that we're really trying to highlight is, although you might, for the reliability standard of maybe 100 or 200 hours, you might need some gas to deal with a winter period. By the time you add enough solar and wind to the system, plus other types of low carbon flex, you might actually not have gas being price setting so often. And so, although the kind of a lot of headlines that came out from the REMA piece, I think actually a little bit the detail underneath was very much like, yes, there'll be this gas. Yes, it will be capacity for those particular times. But no, it's not going to be the backbone of how the market functions as it is in kind of today's market.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like what you're seeing out of, some people at DESNA is like government. It's clear that like, especially as we're progressing those low carbon alternatives, so like hydrogen, CCS, long duration energy storage, they're still like kind of, even though we keep talking about it each year, they're not kind of closer to reality. And so if that doesn't happen, you need something you can rely on.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of what is driving this.
Government were expressly calling that out as well. So whilst we're talking about an optimized CM, which is what they see as the future system for bringing capacity through various minima, etc., they also call out DPA, CCUS.
DPA is
dispatchable power agreement.
Yeah.
Then we got LDES, so long duration energy storage, and CCUS, so carbon capture and use of carbon capture,
utilization,
storage. Yeah, utilization and storage. Thank you. And those are effectively schemes where they're not within the capacity market at the moment. They want them to be within the capacity market, but they aren't going to be at the moment because those techs aren't commercially viable and in today's market. And so they want to treat them through what they call bespoke schemes for a period of time until they can prove they are viable, and then they'll bring them into the CM later on. So I think that's probably another one of these kind of really interesting areas that's come out, which is government have kind of been very frank about those schemes to say, okay, they're not quite there yet, but we still want them because they're one of the ways that we could do this in 2040, 2045. We need to see them through to some sort of maturity. If they then get there, then we'll put them into the kind of the commercial competition of the CM. I think it's one of those areas that feels to me to be actually something where they've really got it right, which is like, let's back some of these techs, let's see them through to maturity, and then let's put them into the CM.
It needs support. Like we had that kind of CCS support, which was announced sort of, 10 years ago, and then it got kind of pulled. And so, we see it with renewables. You need that kind of probably a bit of the push. I think what's important is how they transition from those support schemes into like a capacity market, because at some point they do need to move into more of a competitive sort of market-based model.
And maybe to touch on one of those, so long duration energy storage, that is kind of linked within the whole REMA piece. Now that is looking for 6 hours of duration, potentially up to 50 gigs of 6 hour duration, but isn't including lithium as one of the options. What do you think about that as a structure?
I think there's been quite a lot of consultation responses questioning the decision to exclude lithium from the LDES funding. Yeah, clearly it needs to be changed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's like I think it goes into this like definition of it. Like I would still argue like 6 hours is not long. Like 100 hours is long, 50 hours is long, 6 hours is not that long. And so, if you are going to define it as that, then let lithium compete for that, but otherwise change.
Yeah, it comes back to the same thing again and again and again, which is what requirement do you need, and let the market deliver the lowest cost solution. And storage is commercially proven, it is at scale, it works, and it can easily do 6 hours because you can derate it. We saw that through the latest derating factors where we had a bunch of storage coming in the CM at 9 hours. To exclude a technology type because it's perceived as being commercially viable seems like you're missing a trick. It's commercially viable at a 1 and 2 hour system. It's not really at a 6 hour if you're actually building 6 hours worth of storage.
So here we would say, if you genuinely need things that run for 100 hours, go out and procure things that run for 100 hours. But we would also still say, similarly to CCUS and like hydrogen to power, for example, that it's probably worth doing some incubators of this. It's probably worth like testing this stuff out, but don't chuck a load of money at it until you've actually got some real proof points that can show you that this tech's actually delivering.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Opportunity, usually do anything you'd like to plug, but given that this is just a purely internal podcast, I think we'll skip over that. But in terms of contrarian view, it would be great to get one.
So my contrarian view is that REMA is quite heavily dominated by the National Grid ESO, or now NESO. So the National Grid team is very large compared to some of the other parties in the energy system, so DESNZ, Ofgem, Elexon. As a result, they've got a lot more kind of say in what goes on and some of the decisions that are being made. And National Grid is ultimately, in its current form, I know it's transitioning to be more of a public body, but it is a private company. And it feels a little bit like the government have outsourced reforming our electricity markets to a private company. So I just think for any listeners, if to get your views into REMA, try and get those board positions within the REMA, the consultation. Do respond to the consultation with your opinions, because some of the decisions might be, I'm sure it's not intentionally, but they will be vested for a system operator, for example, that gate closure decision. Whereas that might not actually be for the benefit of the wider consumer. So yeah, that's my contrarian view.
And maybe to put some numbers on that, so yesterday we're having one of the spin-off things from REMA that was a webinar. The number of people attending that, it's about 150 who are like interested parties. So if you're listening to this and thinking, oh God, I'm interested, but actually do I really want to get involved?
It's difficult, particularly with smaller companies, you don't have masses of resource to spend on policy. So it's a bit of a risk.
Yeah. But that is the kind of like 150 is almost like the sample size of people who are kind of really closely in the detail. So as you say, like the ability to join that and to contribute to it does actually move the needle.
For sure.
Wendel touched on what Robyn said before, like everyone involved in the sort of like REMA process, government, National Grid, all the kind of private companies involved, they've all got like vested interests, and sort of they all have they operating within the system at the moment. They've all got a preferred route, and I think ultimately no one's going to be like kind of completely happy with the final outcome. So at some point you just need to kind of make a decision and kind of commit to it. And so I think that whatever gets decided, there'll be lots of kind of arguments against it, but kind of just need to make a decision at some point.
Maybe it's the thing that if everyone's a little bit annoyed, you've probably done a really good job.
Okay, yeah, that's actually a good place to end it. So Robyn, Wendel, thank you very much for the update. REMA Part 2. We'll give it another 18 months and we'll have the final outcome. So keep posted, keep your ears on the lookout for that. Thank you very much for listening to today's podcast, and we'll see you next time.